You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lipp, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Nathan Whitaker, CEO of Stimulus Technologies. And today we are going to be talking about tech issues with supply chain. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to Stimulus Tech Talk.
So we have seen over the past few years a lot of issues with supply chain, and some of those are technical. So what are some of those? What are the biggest issues supply chains face when it comes to technology?
Certainly, I think you mentioned a few years, a lot of supply chain issues related to COVID, but we've seen, other supply chain issues that have come up that have caused, problems down the line. And I think the biggest one that we're seeing is cybersecurity issues, I think on two fronts, one of them being around payments. So we can dive into that a little bit around, vendors having payment issues due to some type of hacking attack or stolen credentials, things like that. And then the other one is issues of vendors that have remote access perpetrating cybersecurity attacks on other vendors. One vendor, gets compromised, and then they're able to use that account to potentially get into other vendors. So we're talking, more on a cybersecurity front than, issues with getting parts and pieces, internationally, things like that, which is certainly another problem that can come up. But we're talking from a cybersecurity front on how vendors can cause major disruptions in your organization if they are susceptible to an attack.
So how does the supply chain work? Like what's part of the supply chain that's going to affect like small to medium businesses?
Well, I think all companies buy products from other businesses. We had a podcast, I think last week on manufacturing, and that's why we're diving into this a little bit more. So, if you're a manufacturer, you're probably buying supplies and parts from maybe from raw materials, or you have pieces that come, as part of a larger assembly that you have to buy. So, that's certainly the glaring obvious issue is for manufacturers having supply chain issues to be able to produce the products that they're looking at. I think there's other supply chain things. We all rely on vendors for our software. A lot of software as a service vendors we work with, but we also, have a lot of vendors that, do other work for us, whether it's our accountants, our lawyers, other professional services that we work with, potentially technology vendors, software vendors. There's, every company has a plethora of vendors that they work with that allow their business to operate effectively. And so, if you have a break in with one of those vendors, that it could cause major disruptions in your company. I think of a quick example here. A few years ago, we talked about the car dealerships and the issue with their software as a service vendor that took down over 10,000 car dealerships because they were part of a cybersecurity attack, the software as a service vendor. So, there's over 10,000 car dealerships that couldn't sell a car. They couldn't work on any service on the vehicles, and it lasted almost 30 days before they were fully up and running. And so, a cyber attack on a critical vendor can cause significant issues to your business. So that's what I want you to think about in this episode is, who are your critical vendors that you rely on to do your business every day, and what happens if that critical vendor goes offline, and then we're still, if can an attack come through that critical vendor into your business. Not to scare you too much, but I think we have a lot of reliance on vendors that can cause, damage to our company. Even, something like Microsoft. We're recording this in the middle of January, and Microsoft had a 10-hour outage on their Microsoft 365 the day before we recorded this. So emails for most of the Western US were offline for about 10 hours. And, certainly a disruption. It came back up. All emails were eventually delivered. But for that 10-hour period of time, if emails were a critical part of how you communicate in your business, it could cause, disruptions for your business. So we rely on so many vendors, especially the software as a service vendors, cloud vendors. They can cause major disruptions to your business.
So I'm sure the question that might be jumping into people's minds, if you're working with the vendor and they're the ones getting the attack, what do we do? Not just a response, but is there something that we can do as a business? Can businesses do proactively in that case?
Well, I think some of the things, the proactive, I think, is a good case in point. There's a framework under NIST called Supply Chain Resource Management that you work with your vendors to ensure that they have the similar cybersecurity posture that you do. Now, it's not foolproof, but the question if you're investing in cybersecurity and you're investing in technology inside your business, but you're relying on a vendor that is not enforcing the same type of cybersecurity posture that you are you could you be compromised because that vendor also or has weaker issue? And then more importantly, if they are compromised and they cause an issue on your business, do they have adequate insurance and controls in place to compensate you for the outage that occurs? From an operational scale, these are questions that you should be asking your vendors to understand, where they are. And one of the things, we've talked about from a compliance standards, you can request your vendors to provide you with like a SOC 2 compliance report to get an understanding of where they are, if they are SOC 2 compliant. And you may or may not be, SOC 2 compliant, but that's one way to understand if, especially for the software as a service vendors, the things that they're implementing. I mentioned that car dealership issue before. The service provider had bought a system off of another legacy provider, and the software, come to find out, hadn't been updated extensively for many years. And so there was a lot of gaps in their cybersecurity that weren't resolved that caused the major issue. And so, things that you don't know, because a lot of providers think, well, they're a big company, they're doing all the right things, and that's not necessarily the case. When you're dealing with vendors, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry, a healthcare provider under HIPAA compliance, ensuring that your vendors are also following HIPAA compliance, or at least will sign a BAA with you. If you're in a defense contractor, making sure your vendors are getting compliant with CMMC, or whatever framework is necessary. Have a discussion with your suppliers to make sure that they're following the same protocols that you fall under.
And you just brought up checking with your vendor. There's a commercial that pops up every time I watch a YouTube video. It's somebody asking their potential vendor if they're SOC 2 compliant, and the person starts freaking out because they don't know. Do you find that some vendors don't know what their compliance requirements are?
Yeah, it's really common, especially when you're dealing with other small businesses. If you're a small business, under 20 or 50 employees, you may not have the knowledge or, even understanding of what some of these compliance requirements are. Uh, and
Mm.
SOC 2 compliance is an extensive framework to comply with, and there's different levels. And it's usually, has historically been considered a compliance framework for large enterprises. But as you know, large businesses are more and more doing business with smaller businesses. And, or if you're a small business and you want to move up scale in the type of companies that you do business with, they are going to ask you that question. And it may be the freak out moment of, why are they asking this? What can I do? Can I get, SOC 2 compliant or HIPAA compliant or CMMC compliant in a day? How do I win this contract? And these are, questions as small businesses we should be asking ourselves from a strategic standpoint, long, in advance. And none of these things are overly complicated. They just are good cyber hygiene and IT hygiene to implement. And no matter which framework you implement, they basically have the same things that we often talk about on this podcast. Setting up and enforcing multi-factor authentication, making sure that you're implementing an EDR and MDR, having alerting. Some of the compliance frameworks might require you to have a SIEM, which is a logging system. of all incidents, so you can figure out where maybe an attack occurred from and backtrace it. Staff training. These are things that we recommend you do just as a normal course of business. So if you're implementing the things that we talk about in this podcast from a cybersecurity standpoint, becoming SOC 2 compliant or CMMC compliant is not a big leap. You just have to have a firm come in to audit the work that you're doing and ensuring that you've implemented across the board. So whether it's self implementation, you take for example the NIST framework and you want to implement that inside your organization, that's a very good step towards becoming compliant to one of these compliance frameworks. Or you're just doing it to improve your business and to ensure that you as a company are complying. And then the next step is going to your vendors and saying to all your vendors, okay, what compliance framework do you follow? And maybe give them the freak out of, oh no, they're asking me questions that I don't know the answers to. And maybe it's a time to review your vendors, because the last thing you want, and I'll give you an example that we see very common. I mentioned the payment issue. Let's say one of your vendors, their accounts receivable person's email is compromised, and then that they send out strategic emails to you and maybe some of their other vendors saying our ACH bank account changed. Here's the official form. This is where we want the payments to go. And unsuspecting, potentially some of the vendors change the payment information location, and suddenly they're getting they're sending payments to the wrong place, for example. And so that can happen often, and we've seen it happen often, that a vendor or a customer sends money to the wrong location, and then the hacker has the money and there's nothing they can do about it, and that invoice shows unpaid in the accounts receivable, and then suddenly there's this invoice fraud that happens, and it's difficult to recover. And if you don't have the right insurance, either you can't recover it. So it's definitely a difficulty that happens, and this friction that can happen between companies will certainly be you know uh, if you're not meeting the challenges of today, can cause major issues with your vendors.
And how do we help our clients work with vendors? Because that's something that we talk about that we do.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, from a technology standpoint, a lot of companies, especially when dealing with software as a service firms, there's a lot of interfaces that need to occur between systems, but even, vendors like your internet service provider, or I don't know, there's a numerous, your software vendors. We are the go-between because we understand that technology requirements. Because a lot of times, if you're implementing a new piece of software, maybe you're doing an upgrade or a new software package, there's technology requirements that they have, and so we need to be involved through the process to ensure that you have the right equipment, the right servers, the right software, and everything in place so that your implementation of a new software package goes flawlessly. And then, if you have issues along the way, a lot of times those involve, technology related issues. So, we get involved and help you communicate effectively with your vendor, again, especially in the software as a service or, software vendors, and ensure that those issues get resolved a lot easier without having to go back and forth with a lot of tech speak with people that don't understand it, or want to understand that technology speak.
And if somebody is wondering now if their vendor has security, I know you mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. What are their first steps they should take to see if they are up to speed on everything with their vendor?
Well, they can, ask these simple questions. Ask them if they have a SOC 2 compliance report. If not, ask, if they, have any type of compliance that they're following. As I mentioned before, if you're in the medical space or Department of Defense space, or if you're a financial institution, there's regulatory requirements that you need your vendors to comply with. Ask those questions. I would start, ask, if they have any compliance framework that they've implemented inside their business. And then if they haven't, ask them, do they carry, cyber liability and employee theft insurance coverage? Those are good questions too, and maybe copies of their policies, or ask them to put you on as a additionally insured on their policy, so you have you're covered. And then, have say this would be a good example for one of our clients. You can reach out to those vendors and say, Stimulus Technologies does a good job for us. Would you be open to having them do a cybersecurity assessment on your network to ensure that things are going well for you, and find the holes in your cyber compliance? And so we could come in, happy to do it for your vendors, and do that type of review. Of course, Microsoft is not going to allow us to go in and do a cyber assessment on all the Microsoft systems, but they will send you a SOC 2 report if you ask them to, and they'll show you what everything that they're doing to be compliant. They'll sign a BAA with you too. So, but it's your smaller vendors. If you're relying on a small business as part of your supply chain, that's something that we can absolutely do, is go in there and do a quick audit and give you a report as saying, okay, these are the things that are going well, or maybe it's, we wouldn't recommend continuing doing business with this person because of all the issues. So, or we can help that company become more compliant. So, yeah, we'd be happy to do that, and that's something that are a good referral for us as a vendor that you rely on, and we can do a cyber assessment with them to help them, get compliant and make sure that they're meeting your obligations.
All right. Well, Nathan, that was really useful information I hadn't really thought about until I entered into this. Thank you, and thank everybody else for listening.